May want to go on mute.
There's a little background noise, so Neil, if you want to mute, maybe it's you. I don't see anyone else.
Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, July 20th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman for the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today begins Phase 4 with our 16th webinar in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and the chairman of our committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning this facilitation of the webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It's a great pleasure to be back with you and with all of our other colleagues today. I believe that we are going to have a very interesting discussion. For the purposes of people who may be new to the subject, I would recommend that they download the document Revelation Revealed from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. There is no space or punctuation in the middle of Global Endeavor. It's treated as a single word. And the document you are looking for is called Revelation Revealed. A link to it is toward the bottom of the homepage. When we left off on the 18th of May, we were discussing a portion of Section 8 in paper 195 of the Urantia book, and we will return to that. The final question, though, that I asked panelists on the 18th of May pertained to the fact that the following day was going to be the final broadcast, the final episode of Game of Thrones. And I compared it in my question with the earlier series, The Lord of the Rings, and asked whether these two very, very popular series amounted to a clear demonstration that Western society has become thoroughly secular. To my recollection, there was a general view that indeed this is the case. Some people commented that there were certain idealistic elements in the earlier series, The Lord of the Rings, but that Game of Thrones was entirely materialistic as far as anyone could see. Now, a few days later, I read an article in the New York Times by one of their regular columnists, Ross Douthat. And most of his article, in effect, amounted to analyzing the literary technique of fantasy and its implications in a conceptual sense. But he did, in this article, have an excerpt from other people's writing that I think has a symbolic importance to us. I circulated the article to all panelists who are participating today, and also to people on the mailing list of the Committee for the Global Endeavor who received the announcement. And I would like to read the two paragraphs that I highlighted in the article, which are conceptual. They read as follows: as Alan Jacobs suggested in an essay for the New Atlantis several years ago, fantasy stories are concerned with the transition that the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor described in his immense and daunting tome, A Secular Age. The movement from a pre-modern world in which human lives and societies are understood to be permeable to supernatural forces, dark and light, divine and demonic, to a modern world in which both civilization and the individual psyche are buffered against angels and devils and fairies and the like. This reality prompted Jacobs to conclude that the success of fantasy, quote, may best be taken as an acknowledgement that the great problem of the pagan world, how to navigate as safely as possible through an ever-shifting landscape of independent and unpredictable powers who are indifferent to human needs, is our problem once more, unquote. Now, this may be a bit confusing from a procedural perspective because there are really three people who are involved in this fairly short quotation. The journalist Ross Douthat, who wrote the article in the May 21st edition of the New York Times. Another journalist, Alan Jacobs, who apparently wrote an essay that appeared in the New Atlantis several years before. And the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who previously wrote the book, A Secular Age. But the underlying point that I would like to ask about is whether panelists agree with the conclusion that the problem of navigating as safely as possible in an ever-shifting landscape of independent and unpredictable powers, which the author described as a question for from the pagan world, is now back in front of us. Whether human beings are struggling with this issue of not having a predictable spiritual anchor with which they can assign a degree of assurance and comfort. So let me see if I can get an initial reply. Charles, would you like to take a lead on that?
Well, it's a lot to digest. And the world has been, what I would emphasize is this: the world's been buffeted by forces, largely secular forces, although not entirely, that do come suddenly and with surprises. They surface suddenly, even though there have been underlying factors slowly changing without being very noticed. I've sometimes wondered what is next. And In my opinion, there does need to be a new discovery, a spiritual rediscovery of God in our lives, as in terms of humanity and our individual lives. But there are lots of forces. I just listed six forces the last 300 years that have emerged in a modern way: enlightenment, democracy, capitalism, socialism, internationalism, and militarism. And all of them have taken on largely, although again not entirely, secular forms, and have a great deal of uncertainty. That's how I view it.
Thank you. Marvin raised his hand a little while ago, so I will now ask him to continue the question about whether this uncertainty concerning our status and situation in a spiritual sense has now permeated the world as a whole, specifically from a secular perspective.
Yeah, Neil, first of all, thanks for you and Bob for providing this forum and for inviting us on. I really appreciate it. Let's see, I'm going to read that, the particular phrase that you highlighted, which I want to speak to. The great problem, speaking of the great problem of the pagan world and asking, is this our problem once again in our current emerging global culture? And that is how to navigate as safely as possible through an ever-shifting landscape of independent and unpredictable powers who are indifferent to human needs. That's a very interesting description. My simple answer is yes, we are in that situation again, but the nature of what it is that's accosting us has changed dramatically. In primitive cultures, the unpredictable forces and changes were stemming from the pantheon of, well, first of all, nature that was always unpredictable and could destroy life quickly, unpredictably, and the pantheon of imagined gods and forces, supernatural forces, magical forces that could wreak havoc in human lives at any point in time. And that's their way of anthropomorphizing the vagaries of the natural environment. In our day, global culture, emerging global culture, the unifying culture of communication and shared perspective, worldview that is emerging, doesn't really have that primitive, isn't accosted by those primitive forces and unknown forces, largely because science has banished them, explained them away, and so that's not where the threat comes from. Yet I think the situation is very similar, so where does the threat come from? I think the threat comes from the unprecedented rapidity of change and information flow that is overwhelming for people. The world is changing, information inundates us, and we can't keep up with it. And in postmodern relativistic cultures, and especially in advanced cultures, the value structure has been set adrift. In other words, there's no established good, true, and beautiful anymore. It's like whatever comes, whatever people want to do. So it's a chaotic mix, and it's a value-wise, it's a relativistic mix. There's no absolute up and down, or good or bad. There's no sense of direction, and that makes it unpredictable and very threatening, and moves people into lives that are unstable. And so yes, I think we are in that current state, and my sense is the arrangement provides some ideas that address that situation, and I'll just be very brief. And I think I've shared some of this before with you, Neil. This is from the section on the nature of cultism. I'll just read it. It's a very short paragraph, and then speak a little bit about it. And again, the word they use is cult, but back in the 30s, that essentially meant the generic culture. So I'll just replace that word as I read it. And they're meaning here a spiritual culture when they use the term cult. And they're speaking of it positively, actually. No spiritual culture can endure and contribute to the progress of social civilization and individual spiritual attainment unless it is based on the biologic, sociologic, and religious significance of the home. So that provides biologic stability, sociological stability, and religious stabilizing factors. A surviving culture or spiritual culture must symbolize that which is permanent. This is the key point in relation to what I think we'll talk about. Must symbolize that which is permanent in the presence of unceasing change. It must glorify that which unifies the stream of ever-changing social metamorphosis. It must recognize true meanings, exalt beautiful relations, and glorify the good values of real nobility. So this symbolism provides an axis in life that provides permanence in the presence of this onslaught of unceasing change, and it glorifies the unifying factors in this stream of what they say ever-changing social metamorphosis, which is what creates all of this unpredictability and great distress for many, many people. So a stabilizing culture is vitally necessary in these times. And you know, I've shared with you all before, we're talking about a deep set of spiritual relationships, living spiritual relationships, personal religion. And those relationships take a vertical axis of our spiritual parent-child relationship with God, and a horizontal axis in our sister-brother, loving sister-brother family relationships with everyone around us. And that is stabilizing in the midst of the chaos of this rapid culture that society we're in. And that's, sorry to go on for a little bit, but those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Marvin. I would believe that you've highlighted a very important dimension of this. I think there are other dimensions too. If we take the general idea of the author who wrote that paragraph that in effect we're commenting on, the comparison is with the pagan world. In the pagan world, at least in the Greco-Roman tradition, the problem was not just that there was an unpredictability, but also that the spiritual forces that were thought to prevail then, the various pagan gods, could be vindictive. They could be punitive. They could cause famines and floods. They could cause havoc in regard to the civilizations of that day. It was so believed. So it seems to me that part of this question has to do with whether or not there is a spiritual predictability, a benevolent attitude on the part of the spiritual authorities toward the reality of human life in all its dimensions. And if that is the case, do we find teachings of the Urantia book that in effect establish this? Would you turn to that element, Stephen?
Okay, but before I talk about that, I just want to express some sort of doubt that he skips from the pagan world to the postmodern world, as if in between, which I'm not sure what you would call that. That's a long time in between. Let's just call it the Christian era in the West anyway. Whether these independent and unpredictable powers all of a sudden disappeared and were no longer relevant between the pagan world and our world. I'm not so sure that that's true, either in the West or in the East or in the Middle East. I mean, people have always been afflicted by, I mean, let's say you were living in a city in Iran, in Persia, and Genghis Khan was on his way. That's a pretty independent and unpredictable power. Pretty indifferent to your needs. So I'm not sure that there's a great contrast to be made between now and the pagan world and what was in between. I think people always had to deal with independent and unpredictable powers to some degree or other. As far as the Urantia book goes in this situation, I think theoretically, there are teachings in the Urantia book that can be of use, but I think that those teachings will remain theoretical and fairly inaccessible unless those teachings are somehow converted into a religious reality for people in general. And the way teachings and things written in books are converted into realities is through activities, religious activities, cult activities. I think unless some sort of religious reality is created outside of the book, these teachings will not have an impact on on the situation that we're talking about.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to contribute?
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I'd like to agree with a couple of things that are that have been said. But before I do that, let me just mention that this is a particularly interesting topic and one that I hadn't dealt with very much. It's as the subsequent, as our follow-on to the totalitarian secularism section that we started reading, dug a little bit deeper into secularism, which is, I think, one of these themes that I'd like to put some context on. I assume you're asking me the same question you asked Stephen, or am I allowed to kind of go to both ends of the discussion?
Well, I'd like you to be an all-purpose utility player here and do whatever you think is best.
Well, that's kind of how I played baseball, so that's good. I can do that. So let me just sort of mention that you brought up earlier that there were three essential articles, and each one synthesizes on its way down from Charles Taylor's book, which is The Secular Age, that they talked about. That was an 885 page tome that you can find on Google Books, which is really terrific. I've brought this up before. I think anything that we do today, people should go out and go and at least. It's almost like Google has been able to scan almost every book that's ever been in existence, and that one's out there. You can't get all of the pages unless it's 72 years plus a year or something like that when it's out of copyright. It did force me to go to Jacobs, though, which was an 18-page article in the New Atlantic, I believe, and I did read that. And that was a fascinating summary of the Charles Taylor tome, which Dothat then put the two paragraphs out, which got me thinking a little bit. So you've got us catalyzed. You pushed me all the way back to almost read 1,000 pages, but fortunately I didn't have to do that because the Jacobs article was good. I want to kind of mention a couple things about the Jacob article. The primary theme Jacobs took out of Taylor's almost near 1,000-page tome was that he separated, as Steve brought up, he separated the pre-modern man to modern man and said that the pre-modern man essentially was pagan, and all of these spirits and fantastical demons, etc., were porous to the individual. They couldn't deal with these powers. The powers to be could do with what they wanted, almost in the same way that the Greek mythological gods did. Modern man then is now secular, and as the Reformation moved this porousness, it put a buffer, which is the part that Charles brought up. He brought up the term buffer that Dothat brought up, and it buffers the individual. Secularism clearly does that, and I think what Marvin brought up was this information overload, as well as all the other types of overloads that we're seeing from this global society and from our complexity of our telecommunications overloads that certainly is easy for anyone to see in our society that this is the case. So, those are the two primary themes, the pre-modern to the modern, let's say it's the pagan to the modern, the pre-secular to the secular, and the enchanted versus the disenchanted. He spent quite a little bit of time, Jacobs does, on pulling out this idea of enchanted versus disenchanted, meaning that the secular age is a disenchanted fantasy. So this idea that fantasy in the Game of Thrones, which I said in the previous webinar, I had not seen one. I don't have HBO, so I just didn't see it at all. And I really didn't concern myself with it. But I do realize that the concept of this whole fantasy idea is something that's very interesting to talk to. And I think that we all agreed that it pervades our society today. So Steve's idea, Steve, your idea that these two things still exist today, I think that's what you said. I completely agree. Because if you read Jacobs, what he's saying is that, and let me quote this, because he has a great statement here about fantasy. He says, fantasy is realism in the pagan world, and fantastic creatures are at the very least, personifications or embodiments of powers generally believed to exist. So fantasy in its most recent form can be understood as a technologically enabled and therefore safe simulacrum of the pre-modern porous self. Now, so as I sort of thought through that, I came up with the same conclusion I think that you did, Steve, and you can disabuse me if that's not right, that there's this secular society that still has this basic urge to be able to understand all of those complexities of life, those unpredictabilities Marvin talked about, that we still have to deal with. It's just a different form. It may not be elves and goblins and all these sorts of things, but to be able to sit back and watch that in a technological, digital form is, I guess the best word there is a simulacrum. It's something that we can look at. We can, society can. I say we, I meant society. But it's still it's this unwitting secularist attitude that Neil, you asked us that difficult question that was in Section 8, Paper 195, that professed Christians are essentially unwitting secularists. Well, I think that that's probably one of the themes here that's sort of underlying in this. All right, so the second half of the question was, there's certainly more to that, but I'll try to cut this a little shorter. So the second half of that is, what kind of scaffolding, what kind of philosophy, what kind of cosmology teachings in the Urantia book would be helpful? And I think that, the one that really stuck out to me was what the Melchizedek talks about to integrate the inner life to the outer life, develop a universal harmony with your spiritual insights. The true teachings of Jesus were, essentially a full renaissance of the inner life. And the fifth epical revelation is now taking the cosmos from both directions, elevating or putting in modern terms, I shouldn't say elevating, but putting in modern terms Jesus's teachings, which is what we're talking about here. So I do want to just read one paragraph here, if I could, from the Melchizedek in paper 106 to kind of support this theory here a little bit. When man analytically inspects the universe through the material endowments of his physical senses and associates mind perception, and associated mind perception, the cosmos appears to be mechanical and energy material. Such a technique of studying reality consists of turning the universe inside out. However, a logical and consistent philosophical concept of the universe cannot be built up on the postulations of either materialism or spiritism. And I think that's probably what I took out of these articles, is that we're seeing the extremes. And when there's a lot of complexity going on in society, we'll see the extremes. We won't see the center often. For both of these systems of thinking, when universally applied, are compelled to view the cosmos in distortion, the former contacting with the universe turned inside out, and the latter realizing the nature of the universe turned outside in. Never then can either science or religion, in and of themselves, standing alone, hope to gain an adequate understanding of universal truths and relationships without the guidance of human philosophy and illumination of divine revelation. So the teaching that philosophy ought to be the chief pursuit of any society, I think, stands for that. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you. Before I turn to George, I would like to take up part of an idea that Stephen put forward, that there was a major gap of time between the pagan world and now, and he associated that with the Christian era, which is a reasonable association. I would say that conceptually, there was a period of many hundreds of years in which Christian traditional believers had the impression that God was willing to intervene directly in the events of the world, and that possibly it was appropriate to pray for a miracle. Certainly, the idea of praying for someone to be healed from an illness was a very substantial part of traditional belief and practice for most of the Christian era up until the last few centuries, at which point science took over and health was understood to be a matter of human reactions to material influences and perhaps mental states. But my question then to George now is to ask him whether there are comparable assurances about the welfare of human beings and the welfare of the world we live in that the teachings of the Urantia book provide, and that could by implication be at least a partial antidote to this pervasive sense of disquiet and doubt that the article that I quoted mentioned, and that to some degree Bob paraphrased. George? George, you're muted, I'm sorry. Okay.
This has really been a really interesting discussion. I took a little bit of a different tact, I think, because it seemed to me that what Duhat, in the paragraph preceding the one that you're referencing, Duhat, is concerned with, and we've said this before, it's been said several times, an uncertainty about the postmodern, about the possible or the possibility that the old powers may return. And Jacob's subsequent reference to the great problem of the pagan world concerning unpredictable powers points to pre-modern civilization, which in the way I approached it, I guess it's differently. It seemed to me pre-modern means prior to, say, 1600, because it's around 1600 that science begins to poke its head up and start to have an influence on society. And in the pre-modern world, I mean, I think we're perfectly aware that there's still a lot of superstition. And the basic characteristic of the pre-modern world is superstitious fear of the invisible, ghost fear. And in paper 68, ghost fear is described as, quote, a new and sublime sort of terror. The dread of the departed spirits of the dead brought to light a new and amazing form of fear, an appalling and powerful terror. This senseless superstition, some of which still persists, prepared the minds of men through superstitious fear of the unreal and the supernatural, the later discovery of the fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom. That's from paper 68. So the modern era is really, seems to me, predominantly characterized by science and the scientific attitude, which have purged the modern world of many pre-modern superstitions, including those associated with, for instance, Christianity. But science is starting to lose its influence. And I think this is where Duhat's reference to postmodern world comes into play. In what's many people consider this time to be postmodern. And in this postmodern world, increasing numbers of people tend to trust their emotional judgments more than they trust the conclusions of secular science, which is really a profound change. They don't tend to believe in the objective reality of truth as much as they tend to believe in the subjective reality of, quote, my truth, to use the current vernacular. And to be clear, this postmodern idea of subjective truth is based upon a material emotions. It's unrelated to the subjective discernment of truth, which originates in cosmic insight. So I think, in answer to the first question, I think Jacobs has a point, because as an art form, literature, including the genre of fantasy, is not infrequently a harbinger of cultural change. And in this postmodern age, the cultural influence of science is diminishing, and superstitious ghost fear may again become a great problem, and with all of that that implies. In answer to the second question about what is in the Urantia book, which might enable contemporary people to overcome this apparent, well, as I say, I interpret it as a concern over the return of ghost fear, but I'm using, of course, the book's language here, ghost fear, which is the terror that supernatural agents cannot be dependent upon to be friendly. Science has destroyed some of this superstition, but it has done nothing and can do nothing to assuage man's inherent fear of the absolute inevitability of death. The only thing which can overcome this fear, which I guess you would have to say is superior to ghost fear, is the sublime hope of survival after death. So the only real answer, I think, to this second question is that the book offers hope in the teaching once more of the living spiritual reality of the gospel of Jesus. But in a sense, that really doesn't answer the question because, but there are lines of reasoning in the book which can be helpful in discerning spiritual faith, which is at the heart of the gospel. One of these lines of reasoning appeals to the cosmic insight of causation, which is described in paper 16. The divine counselor says that this insight leads to the inference of the first cause. Quote, cosmic consciousness implies the recognition of a first cause, the one and only uncaused reality, end quote. So if an individual is self-conscious of the reality of his own personality, cosmic consciousness implies that his personality comes from this first cause. That is, the first cause cannot be less than a personality, which is something that both this book and Christianity, both this book and Christianity refer to as God the Father. So there's a really interesting example of this distinction between the first cause and the personality of the Father. Rodin is originally contended, and he was a great philosopher at that time. He initially contended that God cannot be a personality because as the infinite and eternal creator of the universe, quote, God is alone in the universe. There are none equal to him. There are none with whom he can communicate as an equal, end quote. However, as the result of his discussions with the apostles, encountered in section 1 of paper 161, he was persuaded that God is a personality. it's a really interesting section to read. This reasoning doesn't prove that the Father is the personality of the first cause, but this reasoning is reflective of cosmic consciousness, as the divine counselor suggests, and this is compatible with the cosmic insight of faith. In paper 101, the Melchizedek says, quote, reason through the study of science may lead back through nature to a first cause, but it requires religious faith to transform the first cause of science into the God of salvation. And revelation is further required for the validation of such a faith, such spiritual insight, end quote. So there is a line of reasoning whereby reason leads to a first cause. Religious faith discerns the personality of the first cause. Revelation validates the spiritual insight of faith. Sorry if I went on too long.
George, I would not say that. I would say that you have introduced quite a few diverse strands. And when I add those strands to what your colleagues have said, namely Bob and Stephen and Marvin and Charles, I must confess as the moderator that I cannot summarize this discussion. It has indeed been extremely interesting. It has pointed in many directions at once, and it would be unwise for me to try or to pretend to say that what I could contribute in a sentence or two captures all the ideas that you have expressed collectively. So I think at this point now we should consider that we've had a very interesting discussion, perhaps more philosophic than otherwise, and that it is appropriate to return to Section 8 of Paper 195, Secular Totalitarianism, as our underlying subject that we diverge from somewhat to discuss these philosophic and literary elements. When we were previously considering Section 8 of Paper 195, one of you had read the first 3 paragraphs and we did talk about them. But I think for the purposes of continuity, it would be appropriate for those paragraphs to be read again, and then for us to continue on with the remainder of the section in the Urantia book as a vehicle for discussion. Marvin, would you be willing to read these first 3 paragraphs, which have been read before, but we will enjoy your voice as well?
I would be glad to, Neil, if you'd be willing to share the page in the document where they exist.
Yeah, it's a page in the Urantia book.
Okay.
Paper 195, Section 8.
Okay, give me a sec. I've got to get there.
All right.
195.8.
Yes.
2081 in the foundation copy.
195.8. I'm on a search engine here, so I'll get to it in just a sec.
The title.
Secular totalitarianism.
Secular totalitarianism.
So which paragraphs would you like me to read?
We have previously read the first 3, but I'd like you to read them again just to create the context.
Okay, and then any further or just stop there?
Stop there, and then I'll call on someone else to continue.
Okay. Section 8, Secular Totalitarianism. But even after materialism and mechanism have been more or less vanquished, the devastating influence of 20th century secularism will still blight the spiritual experience of millions of unsuspecting souls. Modern secularism has been fostered by 2 worldwide influences. The father of secularism was the narrow-minded and godless attitude of 19th and 20th century so-called science, atheistic science. I almost feel like I need to read that again. Modern secularism has been fostered by 2 worldwide influences. The father of secularism was the narrow-minded and godless attitude of 19th and 20th century so-called science, atheistic science. The mother of modern secularism was the totalitarian medieval church. Secularism had its inception as a rising protest against the almost complete domination of Western civilization by the institutionalized Christian church. At the time of this revelation, the prevailing intellectual and philosophical climate of both European and American life is decidedly secular, humanistic. For 300 years, Western thinking has been progressively secularized. Religion has become more and more a nominal influence, largely a ritualistic exercise. The majority of professed Christians of Western civilization are unwittingly actual secularists.
Thank you. In reviewing what we have done before, we discussed the inheritance that produced secularism as a result of the totalitarian medieval church, previous element. And we also, in the discussion on the 18th of May, took up the final sentence in the third paragraph that Marvin has just read, namely, the majority of professed Christians of Western civilization are unwittingly actual secularists. So I merely record that for the record and state that it would now be appropriate to continue onward. Bob, would you read the next paragraph, please? It required a great power, and just that one paragraph.
Sure. Thanks, Neil. It required a great power, a mighty influence, to free the thinking and living of the Western peoples from the withering grasp of a totalitarian ecclesiastical domination. Secularism did break the bonds of church control, and now in turn, it threatens to establish a new and godless type of mastery over the hearts and minds of modern man. The tyrannical and dictatorial political state is the direct offspring of scientific materialism and philosophical secularism. Secularism no sooner frees man from the domination of the institutionalized church than it sells him into the slavish bondage to the totalitarian state. Secularism frees man from ecclesiastical slavery only to betray him into the tyranny of political and economic slavery.
Thank you. I would say that the equation in the middle of this paragraph, whereby the Midway Commission declares that the tyrannical and dictatorial political state is the offspring of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism, has two sides to it. It seems to me that we can accept that as a description of what happened, but that there are substantial parts of the world which are not operating under a tyrannical and dictatorial political state. So the question that I would like to ask is whether that outcome, the tyrannical and dictatorial political state, is the only outcome available because of this combination of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism, or whether there is something else intervening here which perhaps breaks the chain or at least diminishes the net effect. Now, perhaps I've made that question as complicated as possible, but you're able to deal with it however you wish. Charles, would you like to begin?
Yes, I think the statement stands. I regard it as a valid generalization, a very useful generalization. The totalitarian state or totalitarianism has manifested itself at least in 4 major waves since 1917, actively, politically, as an active political force. With the birth of communism, in 1922, the beginning of the manifestation of European fascism, 1933, the emergence of Nazism. These all became active forces in the lives of millions and millions of people. And then in the early 21st century, Islamic terrorism, the use of Islam by groups and perhaps in one case a government that's of a totalitarian nature. Bear in mind that in totalitarian thinking, thought itself or opinion making can become a crime, punishable by death, often was, certainly imprisonment. Although the concentration camp, the term itself was born in Cuba in the mid-1890s, it took on a grim and sinister implication starting in the 1920s, after the First World War. And it has since become a hallmark. With the exception of, as far as I can determine, exception of Islamic terrorism, fascism, modern fascism, Nazism, and communism all had concentration camps, particularly Nazism and communism, which were the most powerful politically and militarily of these totalitarian forces. They were decidedly secular. The state had become the church. What the church previously had occupied for centuries now was run by the state. The state becomes acquires a higher value than the family. Your allegiance is to a cult built around a particular individual leader. He becomes the new father figure in a young girl or boy's life in totalitarian states. I could give examples for several hours of these. And the concentration camp, more or less, is a symbol of its rule, of its sovereignty, of its reign of power. However, it's much worse than that, because the totalitarian mindset, because it is based on atheistic science or scientific materialism and philosophical secularism, devalues the dignity of an individual, a moral dignity of an individual. And the individual now serves the state, power of the state, or a political party in many cases. The state and political party become almost indistinguishable in these regimes. And it invariably leads to a totalitarian disapproval, first of individuals, then of the organs of communication, such as modern press, modern media, and so forth, which they generally seize quickly, early in their inception, and take over. And I'm not talking about the arguments we have in this country. That's not an example. Some of the first things seized by the Nazis and communists were the press, some of the very first arrests that were made. But they go much further, and they begin disapproving entire groups of people. And again, the secularism explains this. In the end, oftentimes, these forces indulge in extermination of groups, or an attempt to exterminate them. And in a number of instances in the 20th century, to kill every man, woman, and child that belongs to a certain group. They may have varied in how they did this, but they have that in common. They share that in common. So this statement stands. Let me paraphrase Winston Churchill. In 1940, when he took command as Prime Minister in the Battle of Britain, in the context of the Second World War, he warned his countrymen, he warned the Parliament, and he indirectly warned the world. He said, if the forces of the Third Reich should win this war, there will be a new dark age made more sinister by science, industry, and technology. A new dark age. And I think that is a reestablishment of primitive fear in our human past. This new dark age is not fanciful. It's quite real. There are different features of it. For example, since 1945, particularly since 1949, when the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb, bear in mind that World War II was terminated by the use of 2 atomic bombs in the context of the World War. Then we had a Cold War. For 40 some odd years, we lived under the threat of weapons that physically could wipe out virtually all human life and civilization, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. It would have meant essentially the end of the white and yellow races in Europe and Asian civilizations in North America. That was all materialistically real. What kind of civilization would give birth to such a thing? A civilization that's philosophically secular and scientifically material would give birth to it. The totalitarian forces simply took them to their limit. The reason those weapons were not used was because they were perceived as suicidal. In other words, even the totalitarian power in Moscow was not going to risk its actual existence in a thermonuclear exchange. But the weapons were there. And from the mid to late 1950s, early to mid 1960s was probably the most dangerous time for the human race. The Most Highs must have had their work cut out for them. But this statement is very insightful. I don't see, sooner or later, given the darker nature and darker side of human nature and the risk of a planetary dark age that we have so far escaped, I don't see an alternative if such forces are not reined in and somehow mastered and overcome. The temple of spiritual brotherhood that Jesus referred to can do that. I mean, the Urantia book, I'll close with a few observations. The question was raised, what can the Urantia book offer? A great deal. A great deal. It can offer what the Divine Council calls spiritual wisdom, the perspective of origin, history, and destiny. The Urantia book, as Bill Sadler Jr. pointed out, presents both on mind and spirit. The Urantia book respects facts, meanings, and values. In other words, it respects science, religion, and philosophy conceptually as real and valuable and useful and productive in human affairs. The Urantia book, I think, is an effective antidote on a planetary scale, at least potentially. I'm convinced of that. Something as powerful as a epical revelation, planetary revelation, is needed to counterpoint successfully, in my opinion, these tremendous forces of scientific materialism and philosophical secularism. We have come very close to disaster since 1914, the beginning of World War I. Very close. Churchill, I don't think, was exaggerating. And the human race must succeed morally and spiritually. It must. It has to. Because the alternatives are very grim.
Thank you, Charles. I would like to try again in this question. Perhaps my original formulation was not fully clear. I'm asking my colleagues to examine the implications of the sentence, "The tyrannical and dictatorial political state is the direct offspring of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism." Now, on the one hand, the sentence states that the tyrannical and dictatorial political state occurred in the context of the confluence of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism. It does not seem to state that that is the only outcome possible. And indeed, in logic, it cannot be the only outcome possible, because one would say that this context of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism does exist in the Western world, as well as it exists in China, where there really is a dictatorial system, and in Russia, where there is a more or less dictatorial system. But we do not have dictatorship here in the United States or in the countries of Western Europe. So my question is whether the confluence of scientific materialism and philosophic secularism leads only to the tyrannical and dictatorial political state, or whether it might also lead to other things.
Just briefly, I don't think so. I think
Well,
sooner or later you're
we
going
don't
to
have a
to.
dictatorial state in the United States, Charles, do we?
No, that's because we brought God into it. There's a reason for that.
All right.
There are other forces. I listed them at the very beginning that are democratic, particularly the democratic forces. We brought God into it. The American Declaration of Independence references God 4 times, and indirectly in our Constitution, religion is referenced indirectly. But in the Declaration, it's explicit 4 times, and that's not a coincidence. If you take out God from science, industry, and technology, etc., the outcomes will be the same, more or less. You're going to have disaster repeatedly.
So I'd like to give others the opportunity to answer.
Sure, but I just want to emphasize that.
Yes. Stephen, would you take a look at this issue? Certainly the result of the tyrannical and dictatorial political state did emerge in the 20th century, and the Midweir Commission was warning about this. But was that the only possibility, or is that a necessary outcome?
I think it's a matter of time. I think over time, given enough time, if there is only the influences of scientific materialism and secularism, eventually societies will all tend to a dictatorial political state. We are not there, I think, possibly because of what Charles just said, that we had other influences that were at our foundation that were religious in nature. But as time goes on, I think the dangers of tyranny and dictatorship increase as the secularist situation and materialist situation endures. If these things endure without any change toward a more spiritual realization in society, we are definitely trending in that direction. I mean, we can see it around us right now. I mean, I don't have to recount to you what the latest news looks like, but we are on the way, and it will be a matter, in my opinion, of decades before we are seriously threatened by a dictatorship in this country if we don't have some kind of serious religious or spiritual renaissance in this culture. Decades may be an exaggeration, but who knows? Nobody can really tell about that.
Thank you. I appreciate your sketching out of various possibilities and timelines. Marvin, would you like to comment?
Sure, Neil. Thank you. I think your question is very interesting, and I'll address it in just a moment. But for me, I need to sort of share a little conceptual context for what I'm about to say. For me, these questions, there's risk in devolving into a simply intellectual or philosophical conversation about these kinds of questions. For me, the way to avoid that, I'm not saying that that's either irrelevant or not valuable. They are valuable and very relevant. But for me, the way to avoid that relative superficializing of the question is to really focus on living experience, how people are living. What's their daily experience like? How do they move through life? What are their days like? What are their emotional and psychological states? In other words, and tie it to real personal religious experience, real experience. And in relation to that, and I think very relevant to what we've been talking about, I tend to think of human beings as needing 2 primary things. And for me, this will guide my involvement in our conversation as a whole. And that is, human beings need a foundation. They need to have coherence and order in their context, right? To function well, to live well. A foundation, and they need a compass. So they need a sense of where they are and what's going on in their lives that is structured and orderly and has value to it, value clarity. And they need a sense of direction and purpose and how how to live their lives, where to head, the teleological question. And I think for me, that colors all of what we've been talking about. Because the issue is there are various forms of tyranny. The church was one form of tyranny, right? In other words, the will of the church diminishes the free will function of the individual in the search for foundation and compass in their lives. The church says, we will tell you what reality is, and we will tell you where to go, and you give us your money and your loyalty and your fealty, and we will rule you, right? We'll give you order, we'll tell you what's going on, and we'll tell you what to do and how to live in great detail. And that's tyranny. That's an abrogation of individual and human free will, which is God's gift to us, right? The modern totalitarian state does the same thing. Different tools, but it says you will give ultimate loyalty to the state will structure your entire life, and we will tell you what to do, and you will give power to those that run the state. And there's nothing higher. We are the highest, right? And the church might have given token allegiance to God, but functionally they said, we're the highest. We tell you what to do. And if you have different leadings from God in your own personal life, forget it. You follow us in your search for foundation or order and direction. And how do we make sense of the statement that most Christians are unwitting secularists? Well, I think the same frame of reference is really helpful, because most Christians do not live their religion. That's what I have found. I mean, they give it nominal influence, but they're not seriously engaged with it day in and day out. And I mean, seriously engaged with it. In other words, they'll go to church Sunday, and they're good people, and they're getting benefit, and they're doing some level of religion. I'm not disrespecting it. When they say unwitting secularists, what they're saying is, day in, day out, moment by moment, they're just not paying much attention to God and the spiritual values that flow from their religion. They're preoccupied with other things, which is another form of tyranny that is a modern tyranny, and this relates directly to your question, Neil. There's another form of tyranny in non-totalitarian states and without a totalitarian religion, right? Ecclesiastical totalitarianism. And that form of tyranny is the tyranny of modern hedonism, capitalism, pleasure pursuit, me. It's a kind of tyranny as well. In other words, what will hold the allegiance of the free will of each individual as they live their lives? What do they live their lives for? What are they reaching for? What are they preoccupied with? What are they thinking about all the time? And how do their actions reflect those priorities? And in that sense, many Christians unwittingly are living secular lives because they don't pay much attention to God day in and day out, and moment to moment. There are many that do, and those are not living secularly. So the ones that are not paying much attention in non-totalitarian cultures, their attention and priorities are grabbed by what's on the internet and what they can spend their money on, and making more money and have a better house, having different kinds of power, security, and getting people to adore them, whatever it is, various addictions. Anything, but not really the priority being, how do I share my inner life with God each moment? How do I allow God's will to begin to inform my will? They're just not doing that much, even though they'll give token allegiance to it. So in that sense, they're unwittingly living a secular life while they nominally believe in some religious values. So then your question is, what does the Urantia book contribute to that situation? Do you want me to touch a little bit on that, Neil?
Well, Marvin, I tend to think that it would probably be better to continue on with the next few paragraphs, because otherwise we will not even finish this section. So I appreciate what you've said. And
well, can I make one brief statement? What does the Urantia book contribute to the resolution or remediation of that situation? I think it gives us a roadmap, but in itself, it's impotent. It is impotent without us to take its values live them out in our lives and begin to share a different way of life with other people. The potential for that.
And if I can paraphrase,
that's where its potency lies. Thanks.
If I can paraphrase at least part of what you've just said, the book, as a collection of words on paper, will only be valuable to the degree that we put it into practice in our lives and that others do likewise.
Yes, it's
what you said. Thank you.
It's an inanimate object.
Right. George, I'd like to ask you to read another few paragraphs. The first one, materialism denies God, then secularism can never bring peace, and to the secularistic revolt. Could you read those 3 paragraphs, please?
Well, 2 paragraphs, okay.
3, materialism denies God, secularism can never bring peace, and then to the secularistic revolt.
Materialism denies God, secularism simply ignores him. At least that was the earlier attitude. More recently, secularism has assumed a more militant attitude, assuming to take the place of religion, whose totalitarian bondage it one time resisted. 20th century secularism tends to affirm that man does not need God. But beware, this godless philosophy of human society will only lead to unrest, animosity, unhappiness, war, and worldwide disaster. Secularism can never bring peace to mankind. Nothing can take the place of God in human society. But mark you well, do not be quick to surrender the beneficent gains of the secular revolt from ecclesiastical totalitarianism. Western civilization today enjoys many liberties and satisfactions as a result of the secular revolt. The great mistake of secularism was this: revolting against the almost total control of life by religious authority, and after attaining the liberation from such ecclesiastical tyranny, the secularists went on to institute a revolt against God himself, sometimes tacitly and sometimes openly.
One more paragraph, please.
Sure. To the secularist revolt, you owe the amazing creativity of American industrialism and the unprecedented material progress of Western civilization. And because the secularistic revolt went too far and lost sight of God and true religion, there also followed the unlooked for harvest of world wars and international unsettledness.
Thank you, George. Since you have kindly fulfilled my request of reading, I would offer you the possibility of commenting on the net balance. It seems to me, looking at these 3 paragraphs, the Midware Commission is not condemning the secularistic revolt as such. In fact, they cite benefits, but they are saying it went too far, and that what is needed is a more balanced approach that would include the spiritual dimensions that Charles and Stephen and Marvin have mentioned. Is that approximately how you would look at these paragraphs?
I would. Secularism is described as that powerful force which freed the West from the tyranny of the church. And the way secularism did that was by asserting the independence of reason from faith and vice versa, faith from reason. So that's not allowed in any other type of civilization, really, except perhaps for the ancient Greeks. Every other civilization, it's always been typically it's always been religion that dominates science to the degree that science is allowed to operate. So the balance here, which I agree with you with, it is a matter of balance. One of the major benefits of secular science over the last 300 years is that it's purged so much superstitious myth delusion and fantasy from religions like Christianity. You know, the Protestants were probably the first, but they were the first to reject the whole transubstantiation myth, where some material substance becomes some spiritual substance by saying words over it. So this is, perhaps that's a little harsh, but I mean, that's effectively what science was able to accomplish. But having done that and eliminated and destroyed a lot of the superstitions, false superstitions that were associated with Christianity, then it got infected with atheistic science beginning of the 19th century and decided that God himself was a superstition. So that's where they went too far. You know, they decided maybe originally they were intentionally revolting against a God they believed in, but it very quickly became God doesn't exist. He's a myth. You know, it's Nietzsche's whole philosophy, beyond good and evil. The whole issue revolves. The whole issue of balance revolves around whether or not you think God is a superstition. And I don't know about your conversation with people. My conversations with people, many people, is they'll give passing acceptance to the idea of God, but they basically seem to feel it's mostly a superstition. It's just a convenient superstition.
George, I believe you have indeed identified an important element. Bob, let me turn to you next. In effect, George agreed with my basic thesis that what is required is a balance. Respect for science and also respect for the spiritual dimensions that are implicit in the Urantia book and certainly that we associate with the idea of God. What is the path, in your view, will lead humanity to that balance?
Well, pretty simply, I think, Neil, it's the italicized word here. As George was speaking, I was rereading this section, kind of thinking, Marvin brought up this idea of teleology, and that's really probably the biggest part, other than cosmic consciousness. Understanding, why are we here? Essentially, what has the Father done? What has the Father instituted in this grand universe education scheme that we do to get to paradise and then go out and provide service into the 7 super universes and maybe even into the ultimate? And I think that if you put those two together, go back to the italicized word to try to answer your question. It's true religion. It's not religion. It's true religion. And I guess basically I would say true religion is conformance to the cosmos. And that's kind of an abstract term. So let me just read one paragraph in the section on the religion of the ideal. And it's pretty simple. It gets down to just a very good basic. I can't say this any better as to what true religion might be here. It says the consciousness of the impulse to be like God is not true religion. The feelings of the emotion to worship God are not true religion. The knowledge of the conviction to forsake self and serve God is not true religion. These are all religion. The wisdom of the reasoning that this religion is the best of all is not religion as a personal and spiritual experience. True religion has reference to destiny and reality of attainment, as well as to the reality and idealism of that which is wholeheartedly faith accepted. And all of this must be made personal to us by the revelation of the Spirit of truth. So, Marvin, I agree with you. This idea that we have to live, I think that's what that last sentence said, is that true religion has to live your true religion in ways that spiritual insight provides. And the only way that we can do that humans can do that, is to be freed of the tyranny on both ends of the extreme, either from ecclesiastical or secular totalitarianism. So, Neil, that's my quick, short answer. Throw it back to the group. Neil, you're muted too.
Got on mute.
I followed your suggestion to mute, and now I have to remember to unmute before I can return to the game. Stephen, I wonder if there is something here that attracts your attention in the ideas that Bob put forward about true religion and the balance that this requires. Do you see a market for this in current society, or is there going to be a need for some major transformation to occur that is very difficult to predict?
My personal feeling is that it's going to take more than individuals living their lives according to true religion. I think it's going to take what the book does talk about, that there's been no example of spiritual truth that's successfully been promulgated on the planet without some sort of group endeavor associated with it. Now, Marvin, I see shaking his head in agreement. It's got to be more than just an individual living the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, that's necessary, but it is not sufficient. So in order to translate these words off of the page, it has to be done in the context of, what you've talked about in your example here about the initial Christian ritual, which there's never been a powerful, an equally powerful religious ritual on the face of the planet. We need to have something that demonstrates, in a way, people feel viscerally and feel emotionally and understand intellectually in a way that has the power of group consciousness. It cannot just be individual efforts on a one-to-one basis. We have to figure out how to create a religion. Now, it doesn't have to be a religion of authority, but it has to be some sort of a group demonstration, what the book calls a cult. Now, a cult is not the best word for us to use these days, but we need to figure out this translation process. And I just want to add parenthetically that these texts that we've been reading that talk about secularism as being only a reaction against ecclesiastical authority. Well, historically speaking, there have been many books written about how the Middle Ages produced what we call the Enlightenment, what we call the Renaissance. There are many values that were produced and preserved through the so-called Dark Ages that eventually gave rise to what we call the Enlightenment. And so ecclesiastical Christianity has many faults that we're aware of, but there would have been no Enlightenment and no Renaissance without the presence of medieval Christianity. That was a foundation in many ways for what we regard as enlightened civilization. So it's not a simple black and white. These are caricatures which are true to a great degree, but it certainly does not give a whole historical picture in terms of how things evolved. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I appreciate the idea of an integration of a true adaptation to religious values. You have used the original word that comes from the remarks of the Brilliant Evening Star, cult. Marvin converted it to culture, but I think in effect you are saying the same thing, that there is a need for a spiritual focus that unifies the lives of human beings in this context that we have today in a way that would be original and new. But I would like to move on. Charles, would you be kind enough to read the next three paragraphs which begin with "it is not necessary," and then "but secularism," and then
Yes.
"without God," please.
It is not necessary to sacrifice faith in God in order to enjoy the blessings of the modern secularistic revolt. Tolerance, social service, democratic government, and civil liberties. It is not necessary for the secularists to antagonize true religion in order to promote science and to advance education. But secularism is not the sole parent of all these recent gains in the enlargement of living. Behind the gains of the 20th century are not only science and secularism, but also the unrecognized, unacknowledged spiritual workings of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Next paragraph.
Yes, one more, please.
Without God, without religion, scientific secularism can never coordinate its forces, harmonize its divergent and rivalrous interests, races, and nationalisms. This secularistic human society, notwithstanding its unparalleled materialistic achievement, is slowly disintegrating. The chief cohesive force resisting this disintegration of antagonism is nationalism, and nationalism is the chief barrier to world peace.
Thank you. I would say that these three paragraphs, if I look at them collectively, involve a kind of a ping pong match. In the first paragraph that Charles just read, the paragraph beginning, "It is not necessary to sacrifice faith in God," the next part of it commends blessings: tolerance, social service, democratic government, and civil liberties. And then in the final sentence, science and education. But in the second paragraph, the authors point out that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth are also involved in the ability to derive these positive values that they mentioned in the preceding paragraph. Then in the third paragraph, we get a downward spiral into disintegration. This secularistic human society is slowly disintegrating. Then finally, they talk about nationalism as resisting the disintegration. And then again, they go back on the idea by saying that nationalism is the chief barrier to world peace. So in effect, gentlemen, what we have is, as I started off, a ping pong match of positive values and negative consequences, perhaps unified by the underlying very positive contributions of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. Is there some way that we can bring this together and create a harmony out of all these diverse strands? Stephen, I see a motion on your part.
Yeah, I just want to make a brief comment about the second paragraph about Jesus of Nazareth. It does say in the book somewhere that although in a limited and distorted form, the Christian church has been the major perpetuator of Jesus' teachings in society. So even though the church has done a overall, let's say, mediocre job in conveying those teachings, it's still been the primary carrier of those teachings. So that just follows up on my previous statement about how the church was very, very important in creating what we call the Enlightenment and also what we call secularism. So there's a relationship there.
Thank you. Bob, I'd like to turn to you and perhaps elicit some kind of a comment on the implicit issue involving nationalism on the one hand as an antidote to disintegration, but also nationalism as a barrier to world peace. So in effect, are the midwayers describing nationalism as a benefit, or are they describing it as a shortcoming?
Yes.
Both. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, this is truly a paradox. And you know, you brought that up when you said the word ping pong, Neil. it's ironic. I said, matter of fact, my notes on this were that it's ironic that nationalism is saving the collapse, because if we read this, if we take the gist of the entire theme of what this is up to this point, at least we have another 3 paragraphs. The terms are devastating. And I think we're really talking about the collapse of civilization. This, that's partly why this is an emergency revelation in my mind. Now that secularism is becoming militant. Just a real quick, just a quick aside here about secularism. I did a little bit of research to kind of get a better balance in my head about how did secularism start. And I go back to my Google Books again, and there was a very interesting book called How Secularism Arose. You can read the entire thing because it was written in 1896, and it shows the militancy. I couldn't read it all. It's a little hard to read everything online and digitize. It's nice to print them. You can't print from Google Books, but you do get a real good gist of it. And there was one sentence in there that showed the militarism. It says, I'm sorry, this was written by Charles Holyoake, and he gave a number of lectures in 1852, believe it, or 1846. Degree addresses were done at Harvard. And here's his quote: to teach men to see that the sum of all knowledge and duty is secular, and that it pertains to this world alone. This was the first time the word secular, he's writing about himself, was applied as a general test of principles of conduct apart from spiritual considerations. Well, to me, that sounds, militant. And, but I'm kind of avoiding this whole paradox here. I'll get back to that in a second. So, I do see that the relators are telling us that we don't have a spiritual problem here, because Jesus's life and teachings, his true religion, is working unrecognized and unacknowledged in society today, someplace. I've reflected on that, and I haven't been able to come up exactly how that would happen, but I'm certain that the Spirit of Truth is involved here, and that the Spirit of Truth does retranslate and provide these spiritual insights to those of us that, or not to those of us, but to those individuals who are beginning to be cosmically conscious. So I don't see this as a spiritual emergency, but I do see this as an ism type emergency, an intellectual, mental, and material type emergency that needs to get resolved from the bottom up. We need spiritual pressure from above, but it still has to have actors that can make the changes. So that's about where I can take this. I don't have a resolution for the paradox, though, Neil.
Well, I'm going to try again. Do we need nationalism, at least temporarily, to prevent society from disintegrating, or are we more advantageously situated if we discard nationalism in the sake that we are pursuing world peace?
That's okay. In that fashion, I can provide an answer that I don't think that the time is right for nationalism to be destroyed or taken apart. That's got to happen slowly. We're the planet is built on Olympics. We go to Olympics every 4 years, and it's a nationalistic, prideful thing. All of that has to be integrated slowly. As a golfer, I see that that's probably one of the sports that's starting to become a little bit more congenial to breaking these barriers down. But there are definitely interstitial barriers that don't need to be pulled apart yet. That's going to take a little bit of time. So no, I don't think that this paradox can be resolved in a flash of thought here.
George, do you agree with that? That in effect, for the foreseeable future, our lives, and perhaps several more generations, we are stuck with nationalism and perhaps can benefit from the fact that it is keeping society from disintegrating under current circumstances?
Yes, I think we'll have nationalism until we have the beginning of a real world religion. There's just no way these various cultures can really live in peace with each other unless they share the same spiritual values. And the only way that that can happen is if somehow there's some sort of worldwide religion, which I'm assuming will emerge from the Urantia book, being a proponent and a booster of such. So I think, yes, we'll have nationalism until there's some sort of resolution to these extreme conflicts between the value systems of different national cultures.
Thank you. I would say, as someone who spent most of my life chronologically involved in international politics, at least from the perspective of a low-level apprentice diplomat, the issue of nations relating to each other for our time involves settling disputes peacefully by negotiation or mutual compromise rather than going to war. And if we have some way of achieving that, then perhaps we can avoid blowing each other up along the lines that Charles referred to earlier. Marvin, do you have a way of harmonizing what Bob has called a paradox, the issue of nationalism and, on the other hand, disintegration, or are you content with where we have largely arrived?
No, I've got a thought, and I'll reread the sentences that are spurring this conversation, and it's a great conversation. That you're posing this question, Neil, and I think all of us have been trying to figure out how to respond. This secularistic human society, the current one, notwithstanding its unparalleled materialistic achievement, is slowly disintegrating. It's falling apart. The chief cohesive force resisting this disintegration of antagonism is nationalism. And nationalism is the chief barrier to world peace. So we're stuck in this dilemma place. And the implication of these statements is that it is a dangerous dilemma place. And that's what I hear from all of our comments. It's not a stable situation, especially with the weapons of mass destruction we have. If these forces of disintegration and antagonism are unleashed without some higher order governing principle or process, we could destroy ourselves. So it's a very risky situation. And the other meta message in this whole section is the only resolution to this dilemma is a spiritual resolution, because the forces that are providing foundational structure here and any sense of compass direction are all superficial. The church has been superficial. Secular science is a superficial phenomenon. Totalitarian secular governments are it's a two-dimensional reality. There's no higher dimension there, right? The higher dimension comes into play when God can actually operate in our lives. And then, and only then, will we be guided toward resolutions to this dilemma. And my last thought is very related and building on to what Steve said. And really what I heard from George and what I've heard from Bob as well. And that is, the world needs a new religious or spiritual culture. And the term they use in that section on the nature of cultism is very intriguing. What they define the word cult or culture, and the definition is that a cult is a technique for cultural manifestation, a technique for cultural manifestation. That means it's a whole complex of things that relate to how groups of human beings function, that manifests cultural reality. It changes the culture, and therefore it influences and changes the way people live and moves them in new directions. And if it's functioning well, that technique for cultural manifestation has a direct conduit to spiritual influence in intimate relationship with God. And that's what's missing on a large scale fashion. And really the implication of what Stephen was saying is, absent a broad religious group social movement that manifests these realities culturally, the movement of the Urantia book remains privatistic. And it therefore remains impotent. It remains inactive. It's not manifesting culturally, except in our small groups. And if it remains simply intellectual conversation groups, study groups, and it doesn't manifest proclamation of a higher and changing, transformative way of living for masses of human beings, then it's culturally impotent. And we will not be able to offer the solution that is being required by what we're currently talking about here.
Marvin, this is a very interesting thought that you've put forward in liaison with your previous remarks, and I agree that there was a relationship to comments by Stephen, for that matter, also comments by the other three, Charles, George, and Bob. But I'm tempted now, and will succumb to the temptation, to ask you how many generations this is going to take, the creation of a new framework of a cultural kind with a spiritual background that can largely overcome the dilemma that we are facing now, a totally secular society with, shall we say, only a tenuous hold on spiritual values.
Excellent question. And I'd respond in a twofold manner. It will take multiple generations, hundreds of years at the least, to launch effectively such an effort, because it can happen much more quickly now than it's happened in previous eras, because the technology of communication and spread of cultural values, or the technique of a cultural vehicle, the essence of a cultural vehicle, can spread much more quickly. And actually, people are much more desperately hungry. So that makes it more rapid. But what it depends on is, it depends on spiritual leadership. It depends on individuals taking the responsibility, beginning to articulate what such a vehicle of cultural manifestation could look like, experimenting, evolving, and beginning the process of development of such a vehicle with larger and larger groups of people out of this revelation that we have. And so, you all know I've been involved with efforts of this kind, and I'm passionately interested in it. And the whole idea of, for me, the phrase is a way of life in the family of God, spiritual family relationship, is the heart of that new culture. And taking the central truths of the gospel, Jesus' gospel, and the gospel of the Urantia book, and putting it together in a package that can be communicated and proclaimed and shared, and helping people to live that way, to live in a new way, is part of the process. But yes, it's a long-term endeavor, but the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first few steps. So here we are. We need to be taking those initiating steps. I'll leave you with one other metaphor, which I like, and that is the idea of a mortar gun. A mortar gun shoots a shell, right? It's a tube about this long, right? And it has very precise calibrations up and down and left and right. And depending on millimeters of change at the initiation of that trajectory can make a difference of miles as to where the trajectory lands, the shell lands. And a friend of mine, Steve Dreyer, once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up someplace else. Which is, I heard that 30 years ago. It's a piece of basic educational philosophy. And Steve was he was the chair of the chemistry department at a local university. So it's like, here we are. We're in the mortar phase, the mortar firing phase. We're at the very earliest stages, the equivalent of the first few apostles and the early Christian development, which will determine in a very large degree the arc of landing of where our efforts land. So we should take these efforts very seriously, the development of group culture, embodying the gospel in a way that is evocative and can change people's lives and begin to affect the culture. And thanks for giving me the forum there.
Well, Marvin, you have been so eloquent and so persuasive that I will refrain from telling you that you are not allowed to move on to the mansion worlds until you get all this done. I wish that really were possible, frankly, but I think everything you've said confirms my own sense that we're looking at generations, maybe centuries, really to achieve all this.
One last comment, Neil. If anyone's interested in what we've been working on, a shameless plug, go to familyofgodfellowship.org, which is a nice, simple website, and it lays out basically a vision and a framework for several centuries worth of work along these lines.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I believe that you're entitled to a commercial from time to time. Stephen, I wonder if you could do us the honor of reading the final 3 paragraphs in the section, starting with the inherent weakness of secularism.
The inherent weakness of secularism is that it discards ethics and religion for politics and power. You simply cannot establish the brotherhood of men while ignoring or denying the fatherhood of God. Secular, social, and political optimism is an illusion. Without God, neither freedom and liberty nor property and wealth will lead to peace. The complete secularization of science, education, industry, and society can lead only to disaster. During the first third of the 20th century, Eurasians killed more human beings than were killed during the whole of the Christian dispensation up to that time. And this is only the beginning of the dire harvest of materialism and secularism. Still more terrible destruction is yet to come.
Thank you. I would like to go at these 3 paragraphs in reverse. I think the most interesting one is the first paragraph that Stephen read. But the easiest target of opportunity is the final segment of the prediction about even more terrible destruction. The Midway Commission was writing this material in the 1930s, and they obviously foresaw a World War II that was still a few years ahead of them. Is that what they meant by still more terrible destruction, or do we have any reason to exclude the possibility that yet another round of massive destruction might be on the way for us? George, would you take a look at that?
Sure. I mean, certainly World War II killed tens of millions of people, but after World War II, in China, somewhere upwards of 80 million people were butchered by the Chinese government. And Stalin butchered, tens of millions. Some estimate as many as 40 or 50 million. So now the question is that the end of it? I'm not so sure. If nationalism is perhaps preventing the disintegration of world civilization, but the other side of nationalism is that it tends to lead to wars. And although war, we've been at war continuously ever since, for a few decades. The United States has just been at war. We just never stop. And now we're getting ready to invade Iran. So, I mean, where does this all, is it just a low-grade fever, or does the fever spike and we all of a sudden have another world war with an appropriate number of casualties associated with such an event? I don't know.
Bob, I will invite you to pick up where George has left off and include your own speculation on the question of whether the massive destruction of World War II and the other disasters that George mentioned, the liquidation of tens of millions of people under the communist regime in China and the Soviet regime in Russia, the Soviet Union, effectively draws a line? Or are we looking at the possibility that there may be yet another huge cataclysm of war ahead of us still?
Well, in the hopes of being hopeful and optimistic, we've yes, George brought up an interesting metaphor. It's a low-grade fever because we're seeing, Vietnam and Pol Pot and the ones that George and then you repeated. What's happened since the 30s. So in an effort to stay optimistic about this, I'd like to think that because of the communications, global communications, because of the watershed that we're going through right now, at least I see it as a watershed. There's always these suddenlies that basically occur in society. I think we're ready for a suddenly. What that will be still remains to be seen in my mind as to what will be when this watershed. There's two thoughts to or there's two definitions of a watershed. Both of them are close. A watershed is a milestone in the event of a culture that makes a great change, and the other one is a watershed is a physical place where water all transpires, and I think that's what happens once you have the watershed. You have a basis for environmental great things that can happen environmentally. So concepts like the Gaia hypothesis, which has been floating out there for a good 40 years now, I think are going to take hold. Some of the great work that we're seeing internationally. I brought up golf. It's these sorts of little pockets of antibodies against the low-grade fever, I think, are occurring. And at some point, there'll be a tipping point, which I think is when the watershed fills up, and it actually occurs, and we have a suddenly that will take place. I still believe that the dates that everybody gave, multiple decades to have things happen, but there'll be these little fever endings, and I have a sense that that the planet will not be in such a dire harvest going forward as we've seen in the past.
Well, I certainly share your hope. I think several of us have expressed a lack of clarity. We cannot rule things out, of course. As human beings, we cannot foresee the future, and that is frankly a benefit rather than a defect. But I would like to turn now to the first paragraph of the three that Stephen read, and I will now repeat it because it's short. The inherent weakness of secularism is that it discards ethics and religion for politics and power. You simply cannot establish the brotherhood of men while ignoring or denying the fatherhood of God. And now, Charles, to you, we have several very important words in this paragraph, a very short paragraph: ethics and religion, and then brotherhood of man and fatherhood of God. Is there a difference between ethics and religion in your view, or are they in effect two sides of the same thing? And then please comment on how ethics and religion relate to the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God.
Well, you can have ethics without religion of a kind. I really am not interested in dealing with that point. Worthwhile ethics require God, and the meaning of the statement is very plain to see. If you subtract the fatherhood of God from humanity, you're not going to get the brotherhood of men. You simply won't. And you will get still more terrible destruction to come, which I think I'm afraid my response to that third paragraph is much grimmer than my colleagues. I don't see any evidence that we're either in the clear or moving in the clear. Both of those have been suggested, both of those ideas. Quite the contrary. I think we've been in a world war since 2001. It's of a very different nature. And I have an argument for that in terms of, I don't see any evidence to the contrary, put it that way. I don't see the idealisms that are expressed don't have a sufficiency of divinity in them. With Jesus and the Temple of Spiritual Brotherhood, one of the ways he described the real kingdom, a lot can happen, a lot can be accomplished, including world peace over time. What killed the Roman Empire was that it made too many adjustments in its norms and institutions too fast. That's why it would be foolish to jettison the nation-state system now. We don't have any replacement. However, we've taken more than baby steps. We do have regional arrangements between nations, and largely economic, some political, and we have international organizations, two of them so far. First, the League of Nations, and now the UN. I suppose it could be construed as baby steps, but they're real steps. They're real attempts. There are forces at work leading toward peace, but you cannot have peace without security. That's where national sovereignty of nationalism comes in. Without God, you don't have a family concept for humanity. You have no place, you have no position. You're not a brother and you're not a sister. Without a family, there is no brotherly or sisterly relationship worthy of the name. Simply can't be. It has to be a force that is spiritually, morally superior to humanity. One that has real power in the heart, in the intellect, and in the soul, to shift identity toward it. And that we do not have. We do have potentials. I do think they were referencing World War II. I suspect they were anticipating the Cold War at a minimum, because the Germans began working on atomic weapons in 1938, by the way. We started around 1942, and we moved faster than they did. They were trying to develop them. Japanese also tried, but they gave up. They couldn't do it. They simply didn't have enough science and physics. But the world is shrinking dramatically. There are certain enormous problems that have created this tension. The world is shrinking because of science, industry, and technology, the effects of it. At the same time, there is no corresponding ethical code, let alone spirituality and religion, for humans to sufficiently master their emotions. It isn't overcrowding. Israel and Japan are highly crowded, but they don't have many problems because they're very civilized in a lot of ways, and they compensate for the overcrowd. The problem is there's a lack of civilization. That is due directly to secularism in its various aspects, which does fuel totalitarianism. Since the Second World War, we've had massacres. In Africa, over 1 million people were killed by hand in a month, approximately a month, by hand, with machetes and knives, butchered. Vietnam had a similar experience. At the end of that war, there was a massacre. The Chinese communists had tried experiments. It was what George alluded to. There was widespread starvation because the experiments in economics failed. And they tried to accelerate their farming program, didn't know what they were doing. Millions died from that. The bodies, it was said, could be seen by our satellites in some parts of China. The Soviets continued with mass murder. They had started in the 1920s, and they just continued in the 1940s and apparently in the 50s. But especially from the 30s and the 40s. And, for example, I'm aware of a think tank, I won't identify it, but one of the ex-Soviet generals said in a 5-year period from 1935 to 1940, 15 million people were arrested, approximately half were shot, killed, the other half were put into slave labor and into their hundreds of concentration camps that they had, hundreds. And in Europe there were massacres when Clinton was president, and we put a stop to it with military action, military intervention. In the Sudan there were massacres. This tendency of mass, the problem, it says terrible harvest, terrible destruction. That doesn't reference only war. It references mass murder and these roundups. And I don't see the evidence that anything has changed in the fundamentals. There are countervailing forces. Democracy is secular, but at least it defeated the worst of the totalitarian forces. In the 20th century, communism, Nazism, and the worst of fascism was defeated overtly in a world war and a Cold War. And we're now subject, ironically, to a religious totalitarianism coming out of the Middle East and North Africa that is worldwide in its targeting. Australians have been murdered in the hundreds. In one instance, 300 Russian women, mothers, grandmothers, and children were murdered by Chechens. Murdered. And there have been smaller numbers. What I'm driving at is the only restraint in greater numbers of this more terrible destruction yet to come is the type of weaponry. I'm convinced the goal of terrorism is to acquire atomic weapons and use them. And I think I have most of my career thought about and speculated on the likelihood that atomic weapons will be used unless diplomacy of a true nature. There's false diplomacy, and Chamberlain was false diplomacy. And there's also true diplomacy that has actual force behind it and can get governments to change at a policy level. Unless this happens, so that the proliferation of atomic bombs and atomic warheads is ended. That's probably our most immediate priority, is to terminate the proliferation of atomic weapons. Because they will be able to kill what previously took a large army to do, and thousands of bombers. Now it can be done with only a few or several bombs or warheads. And I don't see any evidence, frankly. I'm just being very candid. I don't usually offer these opinions at large casually to people, but we are focusing on secular totalitarianism. I see evidence quite the contrary. And there's always the possibility, I'm not saying it will or won't happen, I don't know, but there's a possibility of divine intervention or celestial intervention to prevent it. I don't know what exactly happened in the late 50s and 60s. We were very close to a thermonuclear exchange, by the way. We were quite close. And all historical record indicates that. We didn't have it, though. And I'm certain the Most Highs were very busy and very effective, because they had to respect free will on the one hand. Talk about paradoxes. They had to respect human free will on the one hand and make sure that these weapons were never used. As President Nixon said, you can have these weapons, but they must never be used. I'm afraid that there's a lust for them, their use. And unless it can be forestalled and then prevented, and there are other weapons of mass destruction, but the worst of the atomic ones, they're the most terrible ones. They would fit this description of terrible destruction. They are terrible. Unless this curve can be changed, the trajectory of this curve can be changed through genuine, effective diplomacy, real diplomacy, which involves the political, the military, and the economic, incidentally. You have to apply all three, as you know, Neil. Unless it can be done, this doom that this paragraph references will continue to hang over us.
Charles, I'm sorry that you're presenting such a negative conclusion.
Well, I'm just being candid. It's not something that I pray for it, that it won't happen, that there'll be realistic measures taken to prevent it. But I'm not going to shortchange my end of my part. I have a responsibility to speak the truth as I best understand it. That's how I best understand it.
Well, thank you. And I understand that you best understand it, and then you indeed have a responsibility to speak candidly. I would like to turn to Marvin and ask him to go back to that paragraph in the earlier part of the excerpt, ethics and religion, and then tell us which of those is more important, or whether both of them are equally important in terms of the improvement of society and civilization that we all ascribe to.
Well, I've got several comments.
All right, do your comments and neglect my question.
Yeah. Well, I can respond to your question very simply up front. I think ethics flows. I think ethics can be independent of religion, but then it's relatively impotent. It's only when ethics are in association with genuine religion, meaning interaction with God, that ethics is potent. So I think they're both intertwined and equally important. I want to sort of share a couple thoughts on all of what we've been talking about, and in particular your question, Neil. The most recent one, are we still in a situation where we're in a dangerous situation like they described? And my response is both yes and no, but I think there's one factor that's developed since the 30s is that nationalism is now associated with a marked degree of economic interdependence between the nation states. And that is, the development of corporate entities which have much more loyalty to their bottom line and their own money making than they do to their nation state. So those are countervailing influences that are more stabilizing influences, I think. But on the other hand, as you've observed, the negative change is that we have now weapons that are capable very easily of mass destruction as a result of errors, even much less intentional antagonism. So the way I would characterize it, I think George said low-grade fever. I would characterize it as an ongoing state of Russian roulette. We are at risk. The factors that are in play that they describe in this section remain in play. They haven't changed. It's primarily nationalism and economic interdependence that are holding in check the deteriorating and antagonistic tendencies of a secularistic worldview, which is it's extremely dangerous, and it's roll of the dice, and anything could happen that could set it off. So I'm sort of a little bit with what Charles is saying, and the issue is what's to be done about that situation. I'll make one other observation about the situation itself before turning to that question, and that is, I actually think what's likely to happen, more likely than not, but we're talking probabilities, is I think something really nasty will happen. I tend to agree with what Charles was saying. I think it's just a matter of time unless we interject the resolution, which is, it's very simple what they say. We must have a culture where the influence of God in our lives and how we relate to each other, it becomes dominant, right? And then we'll relate to each other as human beings rather than Chinese and Americans, or Iranians and Americans. When that dominates our behavior and we're looking for the welfare of the whole and global government and global police force, no more militaries, it'll be because God has intervened, because we've said, yes, please, we need your help. So that's the resolution, and only that, what they say is, only that will accomplish it. Nothing less than that will accomplish it at this stage. What I think is likely to happen, I'm hoping this is the what will happen rather than something much more dire, is that this out of control, precarious situation will trigger at some point, because I'm not sure we're going to get the resolution that we're speaking of here, the spiritual resolution, sufficiently quickly enough. And I think what may happen is we may have events that basically scare the bejeebers out of us, that terrify us because of the horror of what we can do to each other in this state, and will scare us so badly that we realize we have no choice to band together and move to a higher level. And I'm hopeful that if such circumstances develop, there will be the spiritually led and inspired leadership to intervene and move forward. It will have to be spiritually led. And I'm also convinced that the angels, our angelic superiors, are ready to intervene in every possible way consistent with their mandates and limitations to move us toward a better outcome, whether that kind of emergency occurs or not. So those
Thank
are
you,
my
Marvin. I will accept your remarks as a very interesting and reflective contribution. I think I have to draw a line now. And for the sake of the viewers who were not aware of our previous transitions and discussions, just explain that in effect, we have been conducting an extended discussion of two types of totalitarianism, one from ecclesiastical motives and more recently, one from entirely secular motives. This in turn correlates with a paragraph on page 109 of Revelation Revealed called Doctrines and Creeds. It was an application of that idea. At the time we resume the discussion, we will turn to the succeeding paragraph on page 109 of Revelation Revealed, which is headed Special Status for the Clergy. And that will entail quite a complex discussion, which I look forward to. Today, gentlemen, we have done quite well in covering a very complex topic. I appreciate the many profound conclusions that all of you have shared with us. And of course, I agree that the future that we can look forward to is still a matter of appropriate hope, but also appropriate concern. So again, gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate your contributions today, and I look forward to our discussion next week.